Welcome, everyone. I'm Linda Imatucci, and on behalf of Converge One, Avaya, and Nuance, thank you for joining us today. We will begin today's presentation after a quick review of your webinar console. If technical support is needed during the session, please click the question mark. The projector icon will open and close the slide presentation. Although all lines are muted during the webinar, the Q&A icon is live throughout the session where you can add your questions at any time. We have also reserved time for Q&A at the end of the session to address any questions that will be good for the group. We'd love to hear from you, so please send your questions at any time. The person icon will show and hide the speaker's bios for today's presenters. And finally, at the end of the webinar, please click on the survey icon to share your feedback on today's event, as well as any event you'd like to see in the future. This webinar is being recorded for on-demand playback, and you will receive a follow-up email with the playback link. With that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Converge One Senior Director, Customer Experience Strategy, Kathy Sobis.
Thank you so much, Linda, and welcome everyone to our edition here of Seamless and Secure Customer Engagement. It's indeed my pleasure to be joined by Todd Hinesley, Senior Biometric Security and Fraud Specialist with Nuance, and Tor Christensen, our Digital Transformation Specialist with Avaya. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about a variety of different topics, all related to biometrics in the workplace and in the contact center, and the benefits that we'll see as a result of thinking about and deploying these types of solutions. So we're going to talk about fraud. We're going to talk about the prevention of it, and that as a complete solution. We're also going to talk about account takeover and how that happens and any updates that we have for you. The authentication challenge, and then we're going to move into some of our voice biometric demos, which we think you'll really enjoy. And we have some use cases, and then we'll follow up with our next steps and our Q&A section. So we begin by thinking about the person that's calling in, and when they call in, who really are we talking to? Are we talking to the gentleman that's at the top of this screen or the one that's at the bottom of the screen? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. And so typical authentication methods look like the questions that are to the right. You'll be asked, what's your account number or your member ID number? What's your mother's maiden name? Can you give me the last four of your social? And so on. Quite frankly, those particular things don't get at the heart of really what customers want. We're putting them through all of this just to make sure that we're not talking to the person that's at the bottom of the screen, and we are talking to the customer that's represented at the top. You know what, though, too? Most of the answers to those questions an amateur can find. They can find it on the web, pretty much all of them, if they're, LinkedIn as part of my social media accounts. And so the fraudster begins to poke at things, poke at items with an agent to really validate using their social engineering tactics at their finest and getting these bits and pieces of information. And they behave like it's their full-time job to do so. So we begin to try and think about fighting fraud and fighting fraud in the contact center almost as a game of whack-a-mole. And we know that we need to improve in one area, and we can, but then some of these bad guys will breach another area. Fraudsters are increasingly turning their attention to account takeovers, and they're more and more attacking the emerging weak link here, which is the phone channel. Contact centers often use this knowledge-based authentication piece to grant access and draw more attention, and that draws more attention to the fraudsters. They're attacking that weak link. And so how we go about using knowledge-based authentication to grant access and moving it to biometric access is really an important point that we want to make here. This is highly vulnerable to social engineering as it sits today. And Opus research says strong authentication is not something that you know, like these numbers and these questions that are on the screen here, but something that you are, like the person and all of the biometric attached that we'll be chatting with you about today. So the problem here is that the weakest link for the contact center for criminals to attack, because they can hang up the phone and call in, and they'll get another representative when they do so. You know, before the pandemic virus hit, this was happening at a rate of about 30% year over year. So 30% of all the fraudulent activity that was happening at an organization was passing through the contact center. Since March 1st, that increased to 67% for most customers. And for most customers today, that's even higher. A lot of customers will communicate via their cell phone as well. So you have to think about authentication methods as being both inbound and outbound, and how you know that that's the person that you want to speak to. I just read a recent report to get current for this particular webinar, and 75% of what's happening with fraud and the organizations is now passing through the contact center. That's unprecedented, to move from 30 to 75% in just a few short months. With that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Tor Christensen, who's going to give us a little bit more background on how the solution will work in our environment. Tor?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And, you know, what you'll see here is a set of things around biometrics. But one of the key messages here has to be part of the complete customer experience, right? So it's woven into the whole call center. Because when you think about a call center, right, the key important things you need to know is who's calling and why are they calling. And so, you know, people have traditionally thought about signaling, Annie, Dinas, but that falls way short. And it really needs to be a dialogue to determine the intent and a set of tools for positive authentication. And, you know, Todd will go through a lot of things about security and password PIN. When you think about counts you don't access much, you forget, as Kathy kind of highlighted, they can be hacked as well. But once you have that positive authentication in a contact center experience, you can unlock kind of all the customer information. What's my preferences? What's my history? What's my status? All of that can determine kind of what that experience is going to be in the contact center. It also unburdens the customer from having to remember, oh yeah, for this account, let's see, it was this set of passwords that I was using. And so it really streamlines that kind of upfront authentication automation. It also can be attached to everything that we do within the call context in the contact center, so that as I've authenticated, that goes with me, and so I don't have to redo it. Everybody hates that in the call center. I go through this process in self-service, IVR, and now I have to do it again with an agent, and then again with another agent. Right? That's just annoying. It also unburdens the agent from having to be the gatekeeper. Oftentimes, they're forced into the position of having to make that decision, is this fraudulent or not? This person seems nice to me, maybe it's not. You know, that's quite a burden and quite a time-consuming process for agents. So being able to unburden them for that really helps a lot. And so if you look at this in a big contact center experience, it provides a better customer experience because it's streamlined as it goes through. It's more secure because you can authenticate them positively. And it lowers the whole set of fraud costs. And I posit that it lowers the set of operating costs because it streamlines this authentication verification process, both within automation as well as at an agent. So, you know, the concept is really tying this into a broader customer experience. So I'm going to hand it off to Todd Hinesley, who will go through a lot more details about the biometric solution and what the capabilities are. So, Todd?
Hey, thanks, Tor. Thanks, Kathy. I'm very proud to be representing Nuance today and addressing your audience, and even more proud to be partnered with Avaya and Converge One. So Nuance, as an organization, as a provider, has been at this and addressing these security, fraud, and authentication challenges for a very long time. In fact, our first deployment of voice biometrics was nearly 20 years ago. It was in 2001. And since that time, we now have hundreds of clients around the globe currently in 34 countries and 45 languages. It's been deployed. So it is language agnostic. Don't have to speak English or Spanish or French in order for it to work. We now have hundreds of millions of voice prints deployed globally. We authenticate and validate billions of transactions every year. And last year, we saved our customer organizations over $2 billion in fraud. So I put some logos up here, really predominantly some bigger ones that are names I thought you might recognize, but they really represent a very small, smattering of the organizations with whom we work. And again, most of these are larger organizations, but we do work with smaller organizations as well, right? So in fact, our largest customer has over 50,000 contact center agents using our tech, and our smallest customer has only 7 contact center agents. So very diverse across the size of the organization. We also vary across the type of organization. We work a lot with financial services and heavily regulated industries, but we also have a lot of customers in the healthcare space, in transportation, in telecommunications, and retail, and many other industries there. We also don't just work in the contact center. Some of these customers use us in the contact center, certainly. Some of them use us in the IVR. Some of them use us in the digital channel, so think web and mobile there. And several of our customers use us in all 3 of those channels. So while today you might just be thinking about your contact center, some will maybe start in the IVR and move to contact center as a secondary phase. They might start in digital and move to IVR. So you can really start anywhere and kind of spread out from there. And some of them are using us for authentication, some are using us for fraud, and some are using us for both of those things, right? So wide variety that's out there. So if you're thinking today, again, about just contact center, one of the beauties of our solution is that it is a platform, and you can plug in and use the capabilities of it as your needs grow and as they change over time. So before we jump into the tech, I thought it might be interesting for the audience to see some of the statistics out there about why we're talking about this today. And Nuance commissioned a study with Javelin just a few months ago, and I'm not going to share everything with you, but there were a few key takeaways that I thought you might find most interesting. And one of the biggest threats we have, and the reason we have such stringent authentication methods in place, is to prevent account takeover. And account takeover, as you can see, has been evolving a little bit. Historically, been very, very strong in the card channel, and it's still strong there. But interesting to see the penetration and the focus that fraudsters have on things like checking and savings accounts, right? Oftentimes that's so they can steal directly from those, or they may want to take over a dormant account to use as a mule account, right, for money laundering. And you can also see ranked up pretty highly there are the online retailers and auction sites like eBay, that are out there. It's an awful lot of fraud that can be committed if you can hijack one of those accounts. And closely behind those, you can see email and mobile phone accounts, right? And so what's interesting about those is, why might they be interested in taking those over? Well, think about the organizations that do out-of-band authentication, right, by sending you an email or sending you a text out to your mobile phone, right? So if I can take over those accounts, I can have much easier access to your financial accounts, which is probably what I'm after ultimately, right, is to get to your money. And then we take a look at how that affects new account fraud or subscription fraud, it's also called. Very, very similar, right, in these areas. The order is slightly different, but you can see there's been a pretty significant increase in trying to open up fraudulent accounts on the online retailers, right, or with these auction sites to perform transactions there. You can also see huge growth in checking and savings, right? So if I can open up these new accounts again and use those as mule accounts as I'm committing more fraud online, I've got to park that money somewhere before I can access it. And we've seen a very large increase there with our financial services customers. And again, you can see card there, you can see mobile phone, and you can see other channels that are pretty susceptible to subscription fraud. And so in order to kind of think about how we protect our organization, you really have to think like a criminal, right? And so criminals, in order to be effective at committing fraud, they want to think like your customers, right? They want to understand how your customers are behaving because they want to try to weave in and hide within that traffic, right, that your customers are generating for your customer care channels. And so this gives you a really good kind of snapshot of how customers today are resolving their payment-related issues, right? And you can see that the number one channel over here, as Linda was kind of referring to and Kathy were referring to earlier, is the contact center, right? It's the call center. Most customers today, when they have a problem, a payment problem, they want to talk to somebody. And so they'll do that by picking up the phone and calling in, or they may walk into a branch, which I personally don't do much of anymore. But they want that face-to-face or that personal, voice-to-voice contact there. They also are using mobile apps increasingly. This is the largest, the fastest growing segment by far. This is how I personally transact for my bank account, my financial accounts predominantly. I'm using my mobile applications, and I imagine many of you are probably the same. But you still see folks who are trying to resolve issues using other channels as well, like SMS and email, as well as social media. And this is actually growing, and you see a lot of evidence of that today. When customers are unhappy, they're oftentimes reaching out to social media. And then finally, I wanted to share with you, what are fraudsters trying to do when they're social engineering, right? When they get a hold of the contact center, when they're trying to make changes to commit account takeover, what things are they looking at? Well, you can see the top two. They're trying to change your email address and your online password, right? And so, these are predominantly because most organizations today are using your email address as your user ID. So if I can get your email address, which is relatively easy to get, and I can change that, then I'm actually changing the access, right, to your account. And, of course, I'm going to need the password as well, so changing the online password is a key focus of fraudsters because although they use the voice channel to commit what we call reconnaissance and setup types of attacks, right, where I'm calling in and validating information I've stolen, or I'm calling in to make changes right here. Typically, the cash out event or the actual theft, the movement of money or commodities, occurs in another channel. So it occurs oftentimes in the card channel or in the online channel. So a lot of focus there. But there's other things, as you can see, that they're attempting to change as well. Sometimes ordering new cards, changing other details that would allow me access to your account. So in order to protect against all this, we have to rely on authentication, and that's presented quite a challenge, right, for all of us. And many of you might have seen this particular, meme or cartoon or something similar to it. And it really just alludes to the fact that we as a society, right, we really are just making security far too difficult by and large for our customers. And that's largely because we're relying on knowledge-based authentication questions, right, as Tor and Kathy were talking about. And so, when we do that, the real challenge that we have is we're making it difficult for them. And not only that, but if knowledge-based authentication questions are your only or your primary weapon, right, against protecting against fraud or account takeover, then when you need to increase your security level, typically what we see organizations do is they just add more knowledge-based authentication questions or more difficult questions. And the real problem with that is you're just going to eventually trip up your caller, right? If you ask them enough of these knowledge-based questions, they're going to eventually get tripped up. But in fact, what you're doing inadvertently is we're really, in effect, just making it easier for fraudsters or imposters because it's very easy for them, easier and easier all the time, for them to acquire that data either from the dark web simply by purchasing it there, lost, stolen, or spilled credentials, or through their own efforts of vishing or smishing or phishing types of social engineering attacks. So let's talk about authentication and the different forms of authentication. So I just mentioned, knowledge-based authentication. Authentication or multi-factor authentication really has multiple categories in it, right? And those fall into three areas in particular. And the first one we refer to as knowledge-based authentication is something that you know, right, like a PIN or a password that you might have. The second one is something that you have, right, so such as a credit card or maybe a mobile phone, maybe even some type of RSA token or a key badge or something along those lines. And then the third one, of course, is something that you are, right, which is what we're going to be talking about an awful lot today, and that would include biometrics such as a fingerprint, a voice print, face print, those types of things. And these are more commonly referred to as knowledge, possession, or inherence factors, right, that make up those three. Now, there's challenges with each one of these, right? So when we talk about something that you know, right, or knowledge-based authentication questions, as human beings, we're typically going to pick things that are easy, right, for us to remember. And oftentimes we're going to use the same, PINs or passwords, right, across multiple accounts. In fact, most studies show the average person has nearly 40 different accounts, and they share the user ID and password across the vast majority of those, which just makes it much easier for fraudsters. And again, as I mentioned previously, they can acquire those details pretty simply through the dark web or through their own means. So in general, knowledge-based authentication or the something that you know factor is not considered a very secure factor. The second one is something that you have, right, a possession-based factor. And the challenge with this is that I might not always have it with me, or I might not have it with me when I need it, right? So if I'm trying to transact and I need my phone or my card and I don't have it, it's extremely inconvenient, for me, obviously. I can't, right? I'm handcuffed, at that point. Or I'm heavily inconvenienced at worst. I'm having to scramble and try to find, what I need. The other challenge you have with that is that a possession factor could be easily lost or stolen, right, by a fraudster and used by that fraudster. So at best, you're going to be inconvenienced if it's lost or stolen. And at worst, a fraudster is going to be able to transact on your account, right? So that particular factor, if it's something that you have, can also be very challenging. And that leads us then to the final one, the inherence factor, which is something that you are. And this doesn't suffer from those challenges because you're always going to have it with you, right? You're not going to forget it. It's not going to be easily lost or stolen. And it's, again, always going to be with you. So, by virtue of these characteristics, an inherence factor like biometrics is really seen as the preferred method. Another method that's commonly being used today, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, and that is these out-of-band authentication methods, such as an SMS one-time passcode, right? Many of you have probably seen these used or might be using them, or you're a consumer or a customer who may have been on the receiving end of one of these. And so what these simply do is they send, a code out to the customer in an attempt to authenticate them. But the problem is that these methods, SMS, was never intended to be used as a security measure, right? Your phone was never intended to be used for security. Very similar, I think of nanny cams and webcams when they first came out. They were designed for convenience. They weren't ever designed with security in mind, and much is the same here, right? So you really have two primary issues with this. One is you're not guaranteed, right, that the customer or the caller is ever going to receive that message, number one, right? And number two, they're susceptible to something called SIM swap attacks, right, which you may have heard or read about. And it's these SIM swap attacks more recently that have been growing, right, in prevalence that are causing a lot of concern among folks right now. And so essentially how that works is you have the ability now for a fraudster to contact the mobile carrier and essentially provide them with their SIM details on your account and make the change so that effectively their phone becomes your phone, right? It's not very difficult to do. You can do this typically over the phone simply by calling up a carrier and authenticating, oftentimes with just knowledge-based authentication. And so effectively that fraudster now is you, and they're receiving your phone calls and they're receiving those out-of-band text messages, that are there. So this represents a huge security hole, and sometimes I get asked, why do they even allow that? Then why are they still, enabling this type of fraud to occur? And the answer is very simple. It's really there as a convenience, right? In fact, it's mandated by law as a convenience for consumers like you and me that when we want to change or we need to change our telco providers, we can actually take our phone number with us, right? It doesn't force us to change our phone number. It's portable, that way. And so that's why that feature exists out there, and it will continue in some form or fashion. But these are the reasons why we really feel like biometrics are the best answer to the secure customer authentication challenge. So let's talk about one more thing, and that is, when is a biometric not a biometric, right? Sounds like a strange question, right? So let me answer that for you. So this is a very common, modality here, right, where folks use their smartphone, right? They're using the biometrics on the smartphone to access their online accounts or access their mobile banking account. So that'd be very similar to Mr. Smith here, right? Mr. Smith is doing that. He's enrolled his fingerprint on his smartphone, and he's using that to access his banking app. But Mr. Smith wants to give access to other people to his devices, right? And he trusts his wife and he trusts his daughter. So he's allowed them to enroll and register their biometrics on his device as well, right? It's great convenience for all of them. But the challenge with that is that the app is now going to treat everyone, right, who's able to authenticate on that device as Mr. Smith, right? So even his wife and daughter, effectively to the bank in this particular case, right, are Mr. Smith, and it's going to allow them to transact. Right? So effectively what's happened here is that the device now is no longer, right, authenticating them using biometrics as Mr. Smith. It's just simply authenticating that that person is authorized on that device. And since what you're really doing is just authenticating the device, the biometric has really essentially become another possession factor and not being used like a true biometric at all. Now, the way around this, if you want to take control of that, is to deploy your own biometric security, right? So in this particular case, if Mr. Smith is using the application, well, the organization has deployed their own solution for it, right? And in this case, what they're doing is they're performing a separate biometric check against Mr. Smith, right, to make sure that it's him and not anyone else that's registered on his device. And by doing that with a system, you know, and a token that they've created right now, that they've managed themselves, right, which in this case, say the user's voice print, now they can allow Mr. Smith to conduct, you know, high-risk transactions or make a purchase, you know, for example, and they'll know with more certainty that it is Mr. Smith and not just someone else who's registered on his device. And that's very important, right, because biometrics really can help you solve so many problems, right? And one of those is the fact that, you know, your customers are going to stay constant, right, across time, right? Oh, sure, your biometrics will change very slightly over time, but we have smart adaptation built into our solutions to account for that. But channels and locations and the devices that your customers use to reach out to you, those will definitely change, right? So take, for example, you know, one of your customers that hopefully remains a customer for a very long time. Let's say they're with you for 20 years and you know, they reach out and contact your organization and check in, say, once a month they log in, right? Well, that's going to be hundreds of transactions, right, over those 20 years, and they're going to make other changes, right? They're going to be changing their phone out. If you're like a lot of people, they're upgrading their phone every, you know, 2 or 3 years. You're going to be using a lot of different devices to connect in. You're going to be coming at the organization through different channels. And so you want to give them that capability. And if you're using detection that's built on device or built on channels and things, well, you know, you're limiting, you know, your customer there, right? Because you're forcing them to use those things in order to properly authenticate with your organization. Where if we use biometrics for this, we can really unlock what I call the human value, right? If you use biometrics, now you can give your customer this timeless token, right, that will last them their entire lifetime. You're not forcing them to rely on their memory, right, like they're having to do today with KBA. You're not even forcing them to come through the same channel or to use the same device, you know, that they use every time they reach out to you. And if we're more selfish for a moment and we just look at the benefits for the organization, you're going to get great benefits too. You can improve your customer retention, you know, for example, because you've got a lot happier customers. You can definitely lower your operating costs, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. And you could even increase your revenue opportunities fairly substantial, right? Because you've got happier customers, you're holding onto them longer, and you can even attract more customers because you're using this type of security tech that perhaps your competitors in the marketplace are not using. So really what I'm saying ultimately is biometrics deliver what customers want today, right? And what do they want? Well, they want this seamless, you know, frictionless, right, transparent authentication experience, right? And they want to do that across channels. And they even want to do it when they change channels and jump from one to another. But they also expect really strong and solid fraud detection and prevention. And in fact, when you look at studies now, the vast majority of consumers still believe that the onus is on the organization to protect them against fraud. Now, they increasingly through education, they know that they're, you know, part of that, and they take on a role, you know, in that and protecting their own accounts. But they still expect the organization to stop fraud. So with that, I'm going to jump out into some of the cooler stuff, and I think this is probably what some of you are hoping or wanting to see, and that is actually a live demonstration of how our technology works. So to do that, I'm going to jump over to a screen share real quickly and show you my desktop and show you the experience of what it would be like from both an agent standpoint and from a caller standpoint, as well. So the screen you're looking at now is just, it says waiting for next caller. In fact, let me just enlarge that just slightly so you can see it a little bit easier. And so what this is this represents what an agent would see on their desktop, okay? So now don't get too wrapped up in this form factor. You can make this look like whatever you want, but this is what comes out of the box. It's just a little web-based widget that we refer to it as. And it's a simple user interface for your agent so they can see what's happening with the authentication decision during the call. And again, for you techies, there's a RESTful API behind this. You can fully integrate it. You can iframe it. There's a lot of ways you can make it look differently or conform to what you want it to look like in your desktop. But for purposes of this demo, it works very, very effectively. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dial into the system. I'm already enrolled in the system, and I want to show you just how fast the system will work so that you can get a feeling for what that experience would be like for your contact center agent as well as for your caller, right, your customer on the other end. So I'm going to go ahead and dial in now so you can see that. So I'm using my cell phone. And for purposes of the demo, I'm just the account number we're using is my phone number, right? So what we're doing is we're checking and we're seeing, do we have that account here? We do have an account number there. Does that account have a voice print on file? Yes, it does. We take the audio that's being recorded from the very top of the call. We're comparing it to the voice print that's on file, and then we return that decision. And in this case, you can see that the decision was a match, which we found out very, very quickly, right? In fact, you can see down below that I was authenticated with 5 seconds passing in real time, right? Just 5 seconds, right? The agent already knows, right, with near certainty that it's Todd Hinesley on the phone, and they can immediately begin to go in and start servicing me, right, addressing whatever my needs are, solve my problem, the purpose behind my call. Right, so think about that, right? Think about that from the caller standpoint, right? I'm immediately being serviced now. I don't have to go through the interrogation process and all that frustration, right, of those knowledge-based authentication questions that you're probably asking today. And think about the experience for the agent, right? How quickly this happens. Agents never got in the business, right, to interrogate, people. But that's effectively what they have to do at the start of every single call. And it's incredibly aggravating and frustrating for them, especially when they get a hold of folks who just don't have their credentials. Seniors in particular, can be challenging. My poor mother, when she calls in, she really struggles at 86 years old, to authenticate in most of the organizations that she calls. So that experience for the agent can be really challenging and frustrating as well. And then if we're selfish for another minute and we say, how much time are we spending today, right, in our contact center authenticating callers? So think about that. If you're taking 30 or 45 seconds or a minute or even longer, right, to authenticate, how much is that costing you today, right? If I could authenticate all of my callers in just a few seconds, how much money would that save me, right, in AHT, right? So huge benefits, right, that you can see, and that's just how quickly that can occur. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I want to show you an example of how we can stop fraud, right? We talked about account takeover. How do we prevent that from happening? Well, let me give you a quick demonstration on that. So my voice is not only enrolled on my account, but I've also put my voice on the fraudster watch list, right? So let's see what happens if I dial in and I try to break into somebody else's account. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and dial in, and I'm going to go on mute so it won't pick up any audio. And I'm going to put in the account number of one of my coworkers, right, Mike Sakers. So now let me come off mute so it'll pick up my audio. And so now what the system's doing is saying, okay, it pre-populates the account number and says, okay, do we have a voice print on file for Mike Sakers? Oh, yes, we do. Again, let's take the audio, compare it to the voice print, and return the decision. Well, you can see already I don't have a decision, and agents very quickly realize they're probably not going to get a match. So they'll automatically start asking the step-up authentication questions of mother's maiden name or your PIN or your password or your cat's name when you were 10 years old or whatever they ask these days. And then you can see, right here, look what happened at the 30-second mark. 32 seconds, we have now flagged this call as a suspected fraudster. Now, why have we done that? Because we checked real quickly and we found out that it wasn't Mike Sakers. But before we return a mismatch screen and just say, hey, a contact center agent, we don't know who this is, but we know it's not Mike Saker, so you're going to have to fall back on your step-up authentication. Before we return that mismatch, we're just going to check and see if the voice that we're listening to matches any of the voices that we have on our fraudster watch list. And if it does, then we're going to return this screen. And so now the agent has the ability to immediately disposition this call, right? So at 30 seconds into the call, they can follow whatever your protocols are for when I've got a suspicious caller. I could transfer that to a senior contact center agent to take it or directly to a fraud analyst. And it's also important to note that at the same time this alert occurs inside the widget here for the agent, an alert's also being generated in real time for your fraud analyst or investigator. So they can immediately begin to investigate that call, or they can batch those calls together and investigate them later. But the important point here is that you can stop the fraudster right here in real time. You can do it very, very quickly, so your contact center agent's not going to waste any more time talking to a suspected fraudster. And this is very powerful stuff. This is one of the methods that we use to stop those $2 billion worth of fraud last year. And I say one of the methods because we do have others, many of them, but one I'll quickly mention is we also not only do this check in real time, but we check all the call audio after the call in what we call post-call analytics. And we can actually pick up the same voices calling in, trying to break into different accounts. Even if their voice isn't on our watch list, this is how we can identify very quickly that suspicious type of activity, and that's how we help our customers save so much in fraud. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end the demonstration, and I'm going to jump back over to our presentation. And I'd like to show you one other thing here, and that is how do we leverage this? So it's great now. I've shown you how we leverage voice authentication in the contact center. But one of the other things we want to talk about today is, how do I increase call containment, right? Because first call resolution is something that we want and something that we know our customers and our callers want. Well, I've got this voice print now. I've stored it in my contact center. I'm leveraging it very effectively, as you just saw, right, for both authentication and fraud detection and prevention. But how can I improve the experience for my callers in the IVR? How can I leverage that technology now to benefit both my customer and my organization? And the way that we can do that is we can actually authenticate the caller just using the very brief utterances that are in the IVR responses, right? So you're going to prompt your caller to ask them to speak, and then they're going to respond. Well, in the past, we didn't have the capability, right, to authenticate them with such short amount of speech. But today we have that capability, right? And so with that capability, we now have, the chance to take a caller, right, who can call in. We can authenticate them, right, using their voice, as well as identify them, as well as capture their intent, all with just one short utterance, right? So let me demonstrate that for you now. And this demonstration is just going to be audible. You'll just be able to hear it. There's nothing to see on the screen. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial into the system. It has natural language understanding, right? So it's just going to ask me how it can help me today. And it's going to encourage me to, to speak a little bit more, right, to say a phrase. I'm going to respond to it and then listen to what happens and listen to how quickly it happens for the caller. So let me put this on speakerphone, and I'm going to dial in and do that for you now.
How can I help you today? You can say, "Here's my account balance."
Oh, sorry. I accidentally hit the hang up button, so that's on me. Give me 1 second. Let me dial back in.
How can I help you today? You can say, "Here's my account balance," or "I'd like to check my last transaction."
Hear my account balance.
Okay, Mr. Hinesley. You've been authenticated. You have $100 on your account.
So listen to that, right? Did you hear that? That call took 22 seconds, right, for me to get satisfied on that. I didn't have to provide a PIN. I didn't have to provide a password or anything else. So what was happening there was behind the scenes when the call comes in, we see the phone number that comes in. We're able to match that phone number, up to an account that we have on file. but we don't know if it's being spoofed or not. So we do a spoofing check and make sure that we can trust the call. And now that we know that we can trust the call, that the number is not being spoofed, we've got the identification part handled. Now we can check and say, hey, do we have a voice print on file for this particular account? We do. Let's capture the audio. And how do we do that? We just simply ask the caller the purpose behind their call, right? How can we help you today? And with only 4 words in my response, here my account balance is all I said, it was able to capture that and authenticate against the voice print that I had enrolled in the contact center there. So it was doing everything you really want to do in your IVR, right? It was identifying, it was authenticating, and then, of course, it was capturing the intent so it can route the call. Or in this particular case, provide me with first call resolution in 22 seconds, right? And that's not the art of the possible. That is absolutely what we can deliver to organizations today with our technology. Okay. Just a quick mention that we also work in the web and digital channel, as you heard me mention before. I don't have plans to demonstrate that for you today, but if you're interested in that, please reach out. We'd love the opportunity to share what we do in that space with you as well. Instead, what I'd like to do is talk about some of the use cases here before we wrap up. And I picked a few use cases that I thought would be very helpful examples for you, just to give you an idea of actually how our tech is being leveraged in the real world and the types of results that folks are receiving from that. And so the first one I picked for you is a customer that's been with us for a number of years, and that's Royal Bank of Canada. Right? And here I've really outlined a number of the benefits that they've received. Right? Just kind of tried to encapsulate some key metrics for you that they have actually benefited from with our voice biotech. And the first one you can see is the enrollment rate, right? They have very, very high enrollment rate, and this is typical of what you can expect now. You can expect enrollment rates and usage of the technology in the mid to high 90s these days, especially with your more frequent callers, right? The ones who are calling all the time, they'll be the first ones who get enrolled, which is exactly what you want, right? Because those are the ones that are probably taking up the most time of your agents, and you want to be able to resolve those calls very quickly and much more efficiently. The second number here is they were able to reduce their average call handling time by 43 seconds. So think about that. If you're paying, roughly say $1 a minute, to make it easy for your calls in your contact center, that's roughly equivalent to about 75 cents of savings on every single call. So when you start adding that up on every call you're receiving, those savings can add up very quickly. The next thing you can see is this big jump they had in CSAT. They really struggled to get their CSAT scores up to 7. And within a year of rolling out Voice Bio, the next survey they did, they had nearly reached 9 on a scale of 10 with respect to their customer satisfaction ratings. So they were really thrilled with what this did. Their customer experience manager in particular was very excited about that. And then the last one here I'm sharing with you is the ROI, predominantly behind the AHT savings. This is not uncommon at all. Many of our customers will see ROIs in less than a year, and some of them based on AHT savings alone, right? So just set aside all the other savings that are available through it that we've talked about. Just purely AHT, you can typically see very strong ROIs. And I grabbed a few others for you on the AHT side that I thought you might find interesting. You can see they range anywhere from 41 seconds worth of savings at TD Bank up to 66 seconds at Tatra. Eastern Bank has got a full minute of savings that they were able to document there. So this AHT reduction is worth an awful lot of savings to these organizations. And I had one more I wanted to share with you because there were a few things on here that I thought you might be particularly interested in. One is the increased self-service at Manulife by 32%. Huge, huge savings by leveraging voice authentication there. Fidelity saw AHT reduction by almost a minute and a half, which just kind of speaks to how challenging the authentication process was there prior to our deployment. And look at Vanguard. They had some high-risk transactions they had to do in batch mode, which they literally did offline and took weeks to process. But with Voice Bio in and the virtual certainty they have in the caller's authentication, they reduced that down to just a few minutes. And the last one I wanted to show you was what Barclay Wealth was able to achieve. And they actually, you heard me talk about the impact on agents and how much they love it. They actually decreased their absenteeism of their agents by 6%. And that was a metric that they didn't even set out to measure at the beginning of the project. But it's a real return, right, that they were able to receive. And then when you look at CX scores, I grabbed a few others I thought would be of interest to you. Tatra had massive increases, the biggest one we've ever seen in Net Promoter Score, which was a 51% increase. Eastern Bank, huge success over there again, both with their customers and their agents. Barclay Wealth, you heard me talk about agent satisfaction. Their customer satisfactions were huge, and I think I shared the RBC number with you previously there. So massive benefits that you'll get in the CX side there. And then as we wrap up here, we talked about several of these benefits. These are typically the key business drivers of the reasons that organizations will come to us. Certainly strengthening authentication, right, to either replace KVA or add some type of multi-factor authentication is important. CX is a huge driver. The operational costs, especially with respect to AHT savings. But fraud is also a big driver. And I wanted to mention the efficiency here because if any of you are working on the fraud side or with the fraud folks, having worked myself in banking for 10 years as a regional manager and been working in the fraud and the risk and security space ever since, I know from working with those teams that they're oftentimes using tools that have false alert rates of 20 to 1 or 30 to 1 or 50 to 1 sometimes you see, which means you have to sift through an awful lot of alerts to get to the ones that really matter. And our system gives you the ability to actually dial it in, to calibrate it and tune it, if you will, to the capabilities of your fraud team, right? So, for example, RBS, or Royal Bank of Scotland, the head of fraud over there, Jason Costain, who speaks somewhat regularly for us on the benefits he's received at RBS with respect to fraud detection and prevention, he actually dialed our system down and tightened it up to where he had a false alert rate at one time of 1.2 to 1, which means that if our system tells you it's fraud, you can be virtually certain that it's fraud. Now, he's since widened that out, and I think he currently has it set, the last time I spoke to him was about 3.2 to 1. And that way he can widen that net, he can catch more fraud there, and he can give his team more alerts to work through because they had the capacity to do it. And he's actually moved team members off of other legacy detection tools and onto ours because of the efficiency and the effectiveness of our tool. So that's definitely a strong driver for some organizations. You heard me mention agent experience. We talked about increasing self-service, but also, don't discount how much a technology like this can help elevate your brand and your image and your competitive position in the market. And we see that also in many markets, like especially Canada and the UK, where as soon as one organization deployed it, it then began to put pressure on the other organizations in their market. And now all of the major, in the case of financial institutions, all the major ones in the UK and Canada are using this tech. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you, just some key differentiators, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Our solution is the only one that works across channels, so web, mobile, the digital channel, as well as voice, whether it's contact center as IVR. We do have 2 biometric factors in the voice channel, which includes our voice biometrics as well as our conversation print, which we didn't talk about today, but is a very unique linguistic biometric that is patented and only used by Nuance. Right, so we're the only ones who have that, and so that gives us 2 biometric factors in that channel, and 3 credentials. So when you add in our device printing that we do, we also can print devices, and we do that as an additional authentication and fraud detection measure. We actually give you 3 credentials in the voice channel, and we're the only organization that can do that. And we're leveraging tech, as I said, we've been developing for a very long time. So deep neural networks are the way we build our algorithms. We're in our 4th generation. Our competitors are only in their 1st generation, which is why our systems are so fast and so accurate and perform so vastly superior to our competitors. And then finally, we are the only organization, the only solution that we know of that has successfully led to the ID and prosecution of fraudsters. We have dozens of cases that we've documented with this. And for that reason, we've essentially become the de facto standard for law enforcement and for the intelligence community there. So if you've got folks on your fraud side that are working with law enforcement to combat fraud, they would be very happy to know that you're using our solution because they're probably already familiar with it. So with that, I'm going to hand it off, I believe, to Tor or Kathy, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Yeah. This is Tor, right? And an excellent job kind of showing that value of security and how it integrates in and the capabilities. And I think with Avaya, this is really built into the whole contact center experience. So we use it to drive what that experience is. So when you think about automated interactions, right, this is really built-in integration to Avaya Experience Portal. We can have business rules to determine the type of, authentication required. So, for example, if I'm looking for the nearest branch, I may not be authenticated. If I want to transfer money, that's a different story. And part of that then is with the whole concept of context is that context of an authentication travels with that interaction. So I don't have to redo that at every step of the way. Once I've been authenticated, then I can have that travel. And it goes to the agent desktop, so they're aware if they've been authenticated. If not, there's the controls. So you saw, the demo earlier, there's that little control that showed the status of the authentication and what to do. That's a widget that can be dropped into a standard Avaya desktop. It really enables the agent to deal with that. And those results can then be used to drive the workflow. So if it's a suspicious call, I'm not authenticated, you could route it to your fraud department to deal with. Or, if you have been authenticated, you can bring it on to the agent with the indication that that's been done. And so it can really alter the path that interaction takes through the contact center. And then we have an audit trail for kind of all the pieces that have been done so that you can reconstruct what's happened after the fact and start to build, both improve your system as well as build the case on that. So, the concept is this really integrates into a complete contact center experience, and that's where we can really deliver a set of values. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy with some closing elements here. Kathy?
Thank you so much, Tor and Todd. It's great having you on with us today. I mentioned early on that finding fraudsters in the traditional methodology that many of our customers use today is really like finding a needle in a haystack or playing a game of whack-a-mole. And fraudsters increasingly are going into the contact center and using this channel in order to grant access and to take over accounts that your customers have. And so there are 5 main benefits that were demonstrated to you today. The first one is, how do we go about cutting fraud in the contact center? And we can certainly do this by the methodologies that you've seen. The second one is cutting the average handle time. Wow, that's an increasing benefit that you're going to get as a result of thinking about solutions like we're presenting to you today. Decreasing that handle time up to 1.5 minutes in some cases when we're reducing the amount of time spent in identification, as Todd had demonstrated earlier today as well. And then increasing containment in the IVR. If you think about how many customers of yours have to bail out of the IVR because they don't have their account number, they don't have their PIN number, or, they fat finger the last 4 digits of their Social Security number, that's huge. And if they're bailing out of the IVR for those reasons and going to an agent, that's not being very helpful to you because you have to start all the way over at the beginning with this long and laborious process that many folks have. And last but not least, as you heard, an increase in not only customer satisfaction, but agent satisfaction as well. If we can decrease the number of our agents that are leaving us through attrition as a result of having a more streamlined conversation with the customer and really getting to the heart of what it is that they're needing and talking to the company about, I think we've really improved customer service overall. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Linda to look for, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Linda?
Yes. Kathy, if you could quickly just cover with us the next steps for everybody while I get the questions that are coming in formulated.
Wonderful. Will do. So our next steps have for you a white paper that we've collaborated on together, Todd and Tor and I, to really learn the steps that are necessary to get rid of this problem that you have. And what we're presenting to you in the paper is not, the be-all, end-all, but it's a layered defense approach. So it's really helpful to you. It might be helpful to you to take to your executives within your companies and talk about the strategy here of not only mitigating fraud, but improving customer experience and decreasing the handle times and increasing the containment rate as well. So we encourage you to look for that paper. It may have a little coming soon block on it. We were putting some finishing touches on it this morning because we wanted to present to you the latest and greatest information that not only we could find, but the information that the three of us collectively could bring to you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Kathy. As a reminder, the Q&A icon is how you send in your questions. And our first question is, what is the risk of false rejects or false accepts?
Sure, this is Todd. I can take that. Yeah, great question. I get asked that question a lot. Really, the system can be tuned and calibrated according to the organization's risk tolerance. So, for example, most of our organizations set their false accept rate at about 0.5% or 0.5%. That means that the system needs to be 99.5% confident, right, that it's Todd calling on before it's going to let me in. Now, we have another organization that set theirs at 5%. So the system only has to be 95% sure. So it's really dialed in and calibrated for convenience more than it is security. Where on the opposite end of that, I have one of the largest investment companies in North America. They have theirs set at 0.1%. So the system has to be 99.9% sure that it's me before it's going to let me in. Now, we've talked to them about that, and we'd actually like them to open it up a little bit more, but they want to keep it locked down really tight. And so the answer is it's really done according to, whatever you feel like is most relevant for your organization with respect to your risk tolerance. And we arrive at those numbers through a tremendous amount of tuning and calibration. So we record thousands of calls during the deployment phase. We create voice prints. We're breaking into accounts. It's called a true user imposter test, and it allows us to tune and calibrate the system not just on your network, right, in production, but your calling population, so your callers' voices that we use to do the tuning and calibration. So we're the only organization we know of that performs that TUIT test, right, when we set up and deploy a system. But that's what allows us to tune and calibrate those according to the organization's needs.
And Todd, right off of that one, I'm going to give you another one. How do you handle synthetic voice attacks?
Yeah, great question. The first thing I'd say is we don't really see them very frequently at all. So I know that there's been a lot of press out there, in the headlines about deep fakes and deep fake voices and synthetic speech stealing this and that. I've seen the articles and read them, and when you start peeling back the layers about what really happened, there were a lot of other techniques that were being deployed to socially engineer folks who have ever fallen victim to that if they have. That's number one. Number two, we've had very strong and very successful, high-performing synthetic speech algorithms for a number of years, and we continue to improve those every year. So with every new release of our solution, we're getting better and better at detecting those voices. We're not seeing the problem really much today, but we do expect it to grow, right? With the advancements in machine learning and AI, we know that'll become a bigger problem probably in the future. So we're already way out in front of it to protect ourselves and protect our customers from it.
And this one is a general question to the panel. With COVID-19 upon us and us all adjusting to a new normal, how does having remote contact center agents change the risk landscape?
I've been getting that question a lot too. One of the ways it's changed is by pushing all of your agents out remotely. There are some of our customers who are concerned that their agents are actually not the ones who are on the phone, right, responding to their customers' calls. And this is especially challenging if you are in an industry where you've got, licensed or certified agents, especially in the financial world, right? Series 6, Series 7, 63 for trading securities and those kinds of things, life, health, annuities. You need to make sure you've got the right agent on the phone. And so increasingly we're being asked if we can use and leverage our voice authentication technology not just to authenticate the caller, but actually authenticate the agent as well. And we do that. Our first deployment of that was many years ago, actually in a prison system where the inmates are not allowed to talk to certain people. They're very limited on the call. So we're doing continual checks on the voice to make sure that it's the right person on the phone and that they haven't handed the phone, to someone else. And so we're increasingly being asked about that tech, and we're starting to deploy that tech, not just for the customers, but to make sure we can authenticate the agents as well.
Thank you, Todd. And I do have a few more questions here that we haven't had a chance to get to, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we will respond to those directly to those people that have sent in those questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today to hear this webinar, Seamless and Secure Customer Engagement. Thank you, Kathy, Tor, and Todd for sharing the strength of the Converge One, Avaya, and Nuance partnership. This call was recorded, and the on-demand recording will be sent to you and posted on converge1.com. Please remember to take the survey and also include what topics you are interested in hearing more about. As we heard, companies of all sizes and across all industries are replacing traditional knowledge-based authentication with biometrics in order to increase containment in the IVR and other self-service applications, reducing the handling times and cutting the authentication time. Now is a perfect time to improve your customer's experience. This concludes the call for today. We look forward to connecting with you again soon. Have a terrific Thursday.